Sarah Martinez had always been careful about checking the weather before her photography expeditions. But that morning, the forecast showed clear skies for the entire weekend. She packed her camera gear, a thermos of coffee, and enough snacks for what she expected to be a 6-hour trip to capture the migrating birds at Blackwater Marsh. The remote wetland area was known for its incredible wildlife, especially during the fall migration season. As a nature photographer for National Geographic, Sarah had visited dangerous locations around the world, from Arctic ice sheets to African savannas. A marsh in Maryland seemed like a peaceful walk compared to her usual assignments. She drove her Jeep down the winding dirt road that led to the preserve, parking at the small clearing where a wooden sign marked the beginning of the trail system. The morning air was crisp and filled with the sounds of honking geese overhead. Sarah shouldered her heavy camera bag and began walking along the raised boardwalk that stretched into the heart of the marsh. The weathered wooden planks creaked under her boots as she made her way deeper into the wetland. Tall cattails swayed gently in the breeze on both sides of the narrow walkway, creating a natural corridor that seemed to lead endlessly into the distance. About 2 miles into the marsh, Sarah found the perfect spot. A small observation platform had been built where several waterways converged, creating a natural gathering place for the birds she wanted to photograph. She set up her tripod and began capturing images of the great blue herons, egrets, and hundreds of ducks that had stopped to rest during their journey south. Hours passed quickly as Sarah lost herself in her work. The lighting was perfect, and the birds seemed unusually cooperative, allowing her to get shots that would definitely make it into her next article. She was so focused on a family of otters playing near the platform that she barely noticed the sky beginning to darken. The first drops of rain felt refreshing after hours in the sun, but within minutes, the gentle sprinkle had turned into a steady downpour. Sarah quickly packed her expensive camera equipment into waterproof cases, but she wasn't too concerned. Rain was part of nature photography, and she had dealt with much worse conditions before. What she hadn't expected was how quickly the weather would deteriorate. The rain became a torrential downpour, and the wind picked up dramatically, bending the cattails almost horizontal. Sarah realized she needed to head back to her vehicle immediately. She gathered her gear and began the trek back along the boardwalk, but visibility was now so poor she could barely see 10 feet ahead. The wooden planks had become slippery and treacherous. Sarah moved carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight down. She had been walking for about 20 minutes when she heard a loud crack beneath her feet. The next thing she knew, she was falling through broken boards into the cold, murky water below. The shock of the frigid water took her breath away. Sarah surfaced, gasping and disoriented, her heavy camera bag dragging her down. She managed to grab onto one of the support posts under the boardwalk and pulled herself up enough to breathe properly. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, and she could feel it trying to pull her deeper into the marsh. Fighting against panic, Sarah looked around for a way to get back onto the boardwalk. The broken section extended for about 8 feet, too far to jump across, especially with her heavy equipment. She tried to boost herself up using the support posts, but they were too slippery and didn't provide enough grip for her wet hands. The rain continued to pour down, and Sarah realized that the water level was rising. What had been knee-deep water when she fell in was now up to her waist. She needed to find higher ground, and fast. Looking around desperately, she spotted a small island of solid earth about 50 yards away, covered with a few scraggly trees. Sarah made the difficult decision to abandon most of her equipment. She kept only her waterproof emergency kit, which contained a flare gun, a whistle, some energy bars, and a space blanket. Fighting against the current and the rising water, she half swam, half waded toward the small island, using cattail stalks to pull herself along. By the time she reached the island, Sarah was exhausted and shivering uncontrollably. The piece of land was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, maybe 20 feet across at its widest point. The few trees provided some shelter from the wind, but not much protection from the driving rain. As darkness fell, Sarah realized the true severity of her situation. She was stranded on a tiny island in the middle of a vast marsh, with no way to communicate her location to anyone. Her cell phone had been in her camera bag, which was now somewhere at the bottom of the marsh. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the water continued to rise around her small refuge. Sarah wrapped herself in the space blanket and huddled against the largest tree trunk, trying to conserve body heat. She had been in survival situations before, but never quite like this. The combination of rising water, freezing temperatures, and complete isolation created a perfect storm of danger. She knew that hypothermia would be her biggest enemy, followed closely by the possibility that her small island might be completely submerged if the water kept rising. The wind howled through the marsh grass, creating an eerie symphony of natural sounds that seemed to mock her predicament. Sarah tried to stay positive, reminding herself that she had told her editor she would be back by Sunday evening. When she didn't return, people would start looking for her. The problem was that the marsh covered thousands of acres, and without knowing her exact location, search teams could spend days looking in the wrong areas. As the first night wore on, Sarah drifted in and out of an uncomfortable half-sleep, startling awake whenever the wind shifted or she heard unfamiliar sounds in the darkness. The space blanket reflected some of her body heat back to her, but it wasn't enough to stop the deep cold that was settling into her bones. She tried doing small exercises to keep her blood flowing, but she had to be careful not to fall into the water that now surrounded her refuge completely. Dawn brought little relief. The rain had finally stopped, but thick fog had settled over the marsh, reducing visibility to just a few feet in any direction. Sarah's small island was now barely above water level, and she could see that several of the lower areas where she might have taken shelter had been completely flooded overnight. She realized with growing alarm that she had chosen the only piece of high ground in the immediate area. The fog also meant that even if search planes were looking for her, they wouldn't be able to see her from above. Sarah checked her emergency supplies and found that she had 3 flares for the flare gun, a handful of energy bars, and a whistle. She decided to save the flares for when she could actually see or hear potential rescuers, as shooting them blindly into the fog would be a waste of her limited resources. By midday, the sun had burned off most of the fog, but Sarah's situation hadn't improved. If anything, it had gotten worse. The water level had stabilized but remained high, and she could see that the current had shifted, carrying debris and fallen branches past her island at a steady pace. The boardwalk she had been walking on was now completely submerged in most places, with only the tops of a few posts visible above the waterline. Sarah tried to signal with her whistle periodically, sending out the universal distress signal of 3 short blasts, followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short blasts again. But the sound seemed to be absorbed by the vast expanse of marsh grass and open water, and she heard no response except the calls of birds and the rustle of wind through the reeds. As the second night approached, Sarah began to accept that she might be stranded for much longer than she had initially hoped. She rationed her energy bars carefully, eating just enough to keep her strength up while preserving her supplies for what could be several more days. The nights were the worst part. When the temperature dropped and the sounds of the marsh took on a more ominous quality, strange splashing sounds in the darkness made her wonder what kinds of animals might be sharing the marsh with her, and whether any of them might pose a threat to someone in her vulnerable position. The second day dawned gray and overcast, with a biting wind that cut through Sarah's damp clothes like ice. She had managed only a few hours of real sleep, spending most of the night listening to the sounds of the marsh and trying to stay warm. Her small island refuge had shrunk even further as the water continued to lap at its edges, eating away at the soft earth. Sarah took inventory of her remaining supplies with growing concern. She had eaten 1 energy bar the previous day and had 2 left, along with 2 flares remaining in her emergency kit. The space blanket had developed a small tear from being constantly wrapped and unwrapped, but it was still functional. Most worrying was her physical condition. Despite her efforts to stay warm and dry, she could feel the early signs of hypothermia setting in. Her hands were stiff and clumsy, and she found herself shivering uncontrollably for long periods. Around mid-morning, Sarah heard something that made her heart race with hope. The distant sound of a helicopter seemed to be coming from the direction of the main road where she had parked her jeep. She quickly grabbed one of her flares and prepared to fire it. But as the sound grew closer, she realized it was moving in the wrong direction, heading away from her location toward a different section of the marsh. The helicopter passed about half a mile away, close enough that she could see its outline through the morning haze, but too far for the crew to spot her even if she had fired the flare. Sarah watched in frustration as the aircraft disappeared beyond a line of trees, its engine noise fading until all she could hear again was the wind and the gentle lapping of water against her shrinking island. That missed opportunity filled Sarah with a mixture of hope and despair. Hope because it meant people were definitely looking for her, but despair because she realized how easy it would be for search teams to miss her location entirely. From the air, her small island probably looked like just another clump of vegetation in an endless sea of marsh grass and open water. As the day progressed, Sarah began to notice changes in the wildlife around her. The birds that had been so abundant during her photography session seemed to have largely moved on, probably driven away by the storm and rising water levels. Instead, she found herself sharing her refuge with a few frogs and what appeared to be a family of muskrats who had also sought higher ground on her island. The presence of other animals was oddly comforting, but it also reminded Sarah of the delicate balance of life in the marsh ecosystem. If the water levels continued to rise, or if another storm hit, even her current refuge might not be enough to keep her safe. She began to consider whether she should attempt to reach higher ground. But looking around at the vast expanse of water and marsh grass, she couldn't identify anywhere else that might offer better protection. By afternoon, Sarah had developed a routine to help maintain her sanity and physical condition. Every hour, she would blow her distress signal on the whistle, do a series of small exercises to keep her circulation going, and carefully scan the horizon for any signs of rescue activity. She also began making mental notes about the patterns of water movement around her island, trying to understand the tidal flows and currents that might affect her situation. It was during one of these observation sessions that Sarah noticed something troubling. The water level, which had remained relatively stable throughout the morning, was beginning to rise again. At first, she thought it might just be a normal tidal fluctuation. But as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this was something more significant. Sarah realized that the storm had probably affected water levels throughout the entire watershed, and that water was still flowing into the marsh from upstream sources. Her island, which had seemed secure when she first reached it, was now being reduced to a strip of land barely 10 feet wide. If the trend continued, she would be forced back into the water by nightfall. The psychological impact of this realization was almost worse than the physical danger. Sarah had been holding on to the hope that she just needed to wait for rescue, but now she understood that her situation was actively deteriorating. She needed to take action to improve her chances of survival, rather than simply waiting for help to arrive. Looking around desperately for options, Sarah spotted something she had missed before. About 100 yards away, barely visible through the marsh grass, she could make out what appeared to be the remains of an old hunting blind, or duck blind. It was built on stilts and rose several feet above the current water level, potentially offering a more secure refuge than her rapidly disappearing island. The problem was getting there. The distance wasn't enormous, but it meant swimming through open water while carrying her emergency supplies, with no guarantee that the structure was actually stable or accessible. Sarah weighed her options carefully, knowing that once she left her current position, there would be no going back. As the water continued to creep up the sides of her island, Sarah made the difficult decision to attempt the swim to the hunting blind. She wrapped her emergency kit in the space blanket, trying to make it as waterproof as possible, and prepared for what could be the most dangerous part of her ordeal so far. The water was shockingly cold when Sarah slipped in, much colder than it had been during her initial fall from the boardwalk. Her muscles cramped immediately, and she had to fight against the urge to panic as the frigid water seemed to leach the strength from her body. She forced herself to move steadily toward the distant structure, using a combination of swimming and wading as the water depth varied. Halfway to her destination, Sarah began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. The hunting blind looked much farther away than it had from her island, and she could feel her strength diminishing with each stroke. The current was working against her, trying to push her downstream and away from her target. Several times she had to stop and rest, treading water while she gathered the energy to continue. Just when Sarah thought she might not make it, her feet touched bottom, and she realized she was in a shallow area near the base of the hunting blind. The structure was old and weathered, but it appeared to be solidly built, with a ladder leading up to a small enclosed platform about 8 feet above the water level. Sarah hauled herself up the ladder, her numb fingers barely able to grip the rungs. The platform was small, maybe 6 feet square, with wooden walls on 3 sides and an open front that faced out over the marsh. It had obviously been abandoned for years, but it was dry and offered much better protection from the wind than her previous refuge. More importantly, the hunting blind was several feet higher than her island had been, giving Sarah a much better vantage point to watch for rescue activities. She could see much farther across the marsh from this elevated position, and she felt more optimistic about her chances of spotting search teams or signaling for help. As night fell on her second day in the marsh, Sarah settled into her new shelter with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The blind offered better protection from the elements, but she was now completely surrounded by water, with no solid ground anywhere within reach. Her emergency supplies were down to 1 energy bar and 1 flare, and she could feel the effects of exposure and dehydration beginning to take a serious toll on her body. The sounds of the marsh at night were different from this elevated position. Sarah could hear the splash of larger animals moving through the water below, and occasional calls that she couldn't identify. At one point, she was startled by a loud splash directly beneath the platform, followed by what sounded like something large swimming away through the water. Despite her fear and discomfort, Sarah managed to get a few hours of real sleep in the hunting blind. The wooden walls blocked most of the wind, and the space blanket was more effective in the enclosed area. She woke several times during the night, once to the sound of what might have been a helicopter in the distance, but she couldn't determine the direction or distance of the sound. Dawn of the third day brought clear skies for the first time since Sarah's ordeal began. From her elevated position in the hunting blind, she could see for miles across the marsh, and the improved visibility filled her with renewed hope. She could make out several areas where search teams might logically focus their efforts, including the area around the parking lot where she had left her Jeep. More encouragingly, Sarah could see what appeared to be human activity in the distance. Tiny figures moving along elevated areas suggested that search teams were indeed working their way through the marsh systematically. The challenge would be getting their attention before they moved on to search other areas. Sarah checked her remaining supplies one more time. She had her last energy bar, 1 flare, her whistle, and the torn but still functional space blanket. She also had the flare gun itself, which she realized might be useful even without additional flares. The bright orange plastic of the gun would be much more visible than anything else she had with her. As the morning progressed, Sarah watched the distant search activity move closer to her general area. She could occasionally hear voices carried on the wind, though they were too far away to understand. The searchers seemed to be moving methodically through the marsh, probably following predetermined search patterns designed to cover the maximum area efficiently. By midday, Sarah estimated that the search teams were within a half-mile of her position, close enough that a flare might actually be seen if she timed it correctly. She prepared her last flare and waited, watching the movement patterns of the searchers and trying to anticipate when they would be in the best position to spot her signal. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the flare gun, her last real chance at rescue. Through the clear morning air, she could now distinctly hear voices calling her name across the marsh. The search teams had expanded their efforts, and she counted at least 3 different groups working their way through various sections of the wetland. Her heart pounded as she realized they were closer than she had dared to hope, but still far enough away that she would need perfect timing to get their attention. From her position in the hunting blind, Sarah could see that the nearest search team was moving along what remained of the elevated trail system, about 400 yards to her north. They appeared to be checking every structure and platform systematically, which meant they might eventually reach her location even without a signal. But Sarah also knew that search operations typically had time limits, and after 3 days, the teams might be preparing to expand their search to other areas. The morning sun had burned off the last of the overnight mist, creating perfect visibility across the marsh. Sarah could now see the full extent of the flooding caused by the storm. Vast areas that had been dry land when she first arrived were now underwater, transforming the familiar landscape into something almost unrecognizable. She understood now why it was taking so long for the search teams to find her. The storm had literally changed the geography of the area. Around noon, Sarah noticed increased activity near the parking area where she had left her Jeep. Several vehicles had arrived, including what appeared to be a command post trailer. Through her photographer's trained eye, she could make out people with radios and equipment, coordinating the search efforts. The sight filled her with hope but also anxiety. It suggested they were treating this as a serious long-term operation, which could mean they expected the search to take much longer. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah watched one search team work its way closer to her position. They were moving methodically from platform to platform, using a small inflatable boat to navigate between the remaining dry areas. She estimated they were now less than 300 yards away, close enough that her flare would definitely be visible if she fired it at the right moment. But Sarah faced a crucial decision. The team was currently moving parallel to her position rather than directly toward her. If she fired the flare now, they would see it. But they might also assume it came from a different location, due to the visual tricks that distance and reflection could play across water. She needed to wait until they were facing her direction and had a clear line of sight to her actual position. The waiting was agonizing. Sarah's physical condition had deteriorated significantly over the past 3 days. She was severely dehydrated, having had nothing to drink except small amounts of rainwater she had managed to collect in a corner of her space blanket. The single energy bar she had eaten that morning was her first real food since the beginning of her ordeal. Her hands shook constantly now, partly from cold and partly from the physical stress her body was enduring. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sarah's opportunity finally came. The search team in the boat had worked their way to a position where they were facing almost directly toward her hunting blind. She could see them clearly through the opening in the front wall of the structure, which meant they would have an unobstructed view of her flare when she fired it. Sarah steadied herself against the wall of the blind and aimed the flare gun high into the air, angling it slightly toward the search team's position. She took a deep breath, whispered a small prayer, and squeezed the trigger. The flare shot out with a loud pop, arcing high over the marsh before beginning its descent under a bright red parachute. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Sarah watched the flare drifting down toward the water. The red signal was clearly visible against the blue sky, impossible to miss for anyone looking in that direction. Then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Voices shouting in excitement, and the roar of an outboard motor starting up. The search team's boat turned immediately toward her location, its engine at full throttle as it raced across the open water. Sarah grabbed her orange flare gun and waved it frantically overhead, making herself as visible as possible from the hunting blind platform. She also blew repeated blasts on her whistle, adding audio signals to help guide the rescuers to her exact position. Within minutes, the boat had reached the base of the hunting blind. Sarah looked down to see 2 search and rescue volunteers in bright orange life jackets, their faces showing a mixture of relief and concern as they took in her condition. One of them, a woman with short gray hair, called up to her, "Sarah Martinez, we're here to get you out. Are you injured? Can you climb down to us?" "Well, Wooding the bear." Sarah Martinez, Wooding the bear, acquired a final P. "We're here to get you out. Are you injured? Can you climb down to us?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper when she tried to respond, her throat raw from exposure and dehydration. She managed to croak out a yes, and began the careful process of climbing down the ladder to the boat. Her legs nearly gave out when she tried to put weight on them, but the rescuers were ready, steadying her as she made the transition from the platform to their boat. As soon as Sarah was safely aboard, one of the rescuers wrapped her in a warm blanket while the other radioed their success to the command post. Sarah heard the excitement in the radio chatter as word spread through the search teams that she had been found alive. The boat ride back to shore passed in a blur as Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally allowing itself to relax after 3 days of constant stress and vigilance. The command post area had been transformed into a small emergency medical station. Paramedics were waiting as the boat arrived, and Sarah was quickly transferred to a stretcher for evaluation. The medical team worked efficiently, checking her vital signs, starting an IV for fluid replacement, and treating her for hypothermia and dehydration. Through it all, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the dedicated people who had spent days searching for her in difficult conditions. As Sarah was being prepared for transport to the hospital, she learned more about the search operation that had ultimately saved her life. Over 40 volunteers from multiple agencies had participated in the effort, using boats, helicopters, and ground teams to comb through the vast marsh area. The storm that had caused her predicament had also complicated the search, flooding access routes and changing the landscape in ways that made navigation treacherous, even for experienced rescuers. The search coordinator, a veteran emergency manager named Tom Bradley, explained to Sarah how the operation had been organized. They had started with the assumption that she was somewhere along her planned photography route, but the flooding had made it impossible to follow the normal trail system. Instead, they had to search every elevated area and structure in a constantly expanding grid pattern, which explained why it had taken 3 days to reach her location. "Your flare was perfectly timed," Bradley told her as the ambulance prepared to leave for the hospital. "We probably would have found you eventually, but it might have taken another day or two. In these conditions, that could have made all the difference." At the hospital, Sarah spent 2 days recovering from her ordeal. The medical team treated her for moderate hypothermia, severe dehydration, and minor injuries from her time in the marsh. Her most serious concern had been the potential for infection from the contaminated water, but antibiotics addressed that risk effectively. Physically, she would make a complete recovery within a week or two. The psychological impact took longer to process. Sarah found herself thinking constantly about the critical decision points during her ordeal. The choice to swim to the hunting blind, the decision to save her last flare for the right moment, and the countless small choices that had ultimately meant the difference between survival and disaster. She realized that her experience as a nature photographer had probably saved her life, giving her the outdoor skills and mental discipline to make good decisions under extreme stress. Sarah's story quickly gained national attention when details of her rescue became public. Her professional colleagues were amazed that she had managed to survive 3 days in such harsh conditions, and search and rescue organizations used her experience as a case study in effective emergency signaling and survival decision-making. The hunting blind that had sheltered her during the final night was later marked with GPS coordinates and designated as an emergency shelter for future use by Marsh visitors. Most importantly for Sarah, the ordeal reinforced her deep connection to the natural world that had drawn her to photography in the first place. Rather than making her afraid of remote locations, the experience taught her to approach them with even greater respect and preparation. She continued her career as a nature photographer, but with enhanced safety protocols and emergency equipment that reflected the hard lessons learned during her 32 hours in the Blackwater Marsh. The flare gun that fired her rescue signal was retired to a place of honor in Sarah's home, a reminder of the single shot that meant everything when her life hung in the balance. She often reflected on how different her story might have ended if that final flare had failed to find its target, and she never forgot the dedication of the search teams who refused to give up until they brought her home safely. Years later, Sarah would return to the Blackwater Marsh during better weather conditions, completing the photography project that had originally brought her there. The images she captured were some of her finest work, informed by a deeper understanding of the marsh ecosystem and a profound appreciation for both its beauty and its power. But she never again ventured into remote locations without multiple backup communication devices and detailed emergency plans that accounted for the unexpected storms that nature could unleash without warning.